Welcome back. My name is T, if you're new here. Well, I mean, you're all new here, but you get the point. I use they, them pronouns professionally and they, she casually. And this is episode 2 of my attempted mammification. In the first episode, I essentially told you about a few incidents at my white liberal nonprofit in the tofu curtain that really had me all the way fucked up. I talked about how a dog procedure was created after a white woman reported me to the executive director for bringing dogs into the office. Me and the dogs aren't allowed inside. Like, y'all just banned us. Y'all just put a ban on dogs and niggas from the office at this point because it doesn't make sense for me to sit outside with a dog in 90+ degree weather. And then I talked about how around the same time, we were also told that we couldn't have children eating in our office because we just got new carpet. Our department head tells us that we can't let people inside because they're concerned about getting crumbs on our new fucking carpet. Even though we're having a block party with free food for the Food Policy Council. And then we really get into the bulk of the story, which is the email signature and me getting reprimanded and charged with insubordination for having pro-Palestinian resources and slogans in my email signature. Then that leading to another policy / procedure being created around standardized email signatures, and then me having a nervous breakdown.
Not my fault. I'm fucking exhausted. It's not my fault. I'm tired. It's not my fault. My brain doesn't work, that I have brain fog, that I keep ending up at fucking Target, even though I don't intend to drive there. Like, I'm trying my fucking best.
And fighting for my life and losing my housing and about to lose my job. Crazy, right? And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you should go back to the first episode. Before we dive back into the story, there's some things that we need to unpack here because a lot has happened. Before we can fully understand what was going on, we have to talk about Hattie McDaniel. Now, I know you're wondering, what does Hattie McDaniel have to do with me almost getting fired? Just stick with me. In 1939, actress, singer, songwriter, and comedian Hattie McDaniel became the first Black American to be nominated for and win an Academy Award in any category.
That I present the Academy Award for the best performance of an actress in supporting roles during 1939 to Hattie McDaniel.
I sincerely hope I shall always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry.
She won Best Supporting Actress for her role as Mammy, an asexual, fat, elderly Black caretaker for the O'Hara family in Gone with the Wind. Her character essentially functioned as the cinematic archetype through which antebellum rewritings of enslaved Black women's forced domestic and care labor were circulated. Her role symbolized how Black women were framed as natural caretakers who took deep pleasure and pride in their care for the white employer's family, especially at the expense of their own families. Mammy became an important ideological pillar of the racialization of domestic work as Black work. While historic, McDaniel's win simultaneously exposed the normalization of racist caricatures that sought to control the narrative of Black labor in the United States. Black women would continue to win more Academy Awards for roles that reinforced connections between Black womanhood and domestic servitude. And as we know, not many Black women or people have won Oscars since then. Now, McDaniel's Mammy did not emerge out of nowhere. It was a cinematic afterimage of a labor order built centuries earlier under chattel slavery. And yes, we're going to talk about slavery. This is a Black labor video essay after all. In Black Feminist Theory by Patricia Hill Collins, which I would recommend y'all read because we should all be Black feminists, Hill Collins argues that under this dependency structure, Black women's labor is simultaneously exploited and indispensable, anchoring white domestic stability while denying Black autonomy. In layman's terms, this meant that white families could not exist, survive, let alone thrive without Black women's labor. Because of this, Blackness was constructed with labor at its core. Black people were expected to labor, and that labor was always imagined as being in service to whiteness. Domestic work becomes Black work because Black women are created to serve, care for, clean, and hold together white homes while simultaneously being denied full autonomy and rights under racial capitalism. This racialized dependence emerged through chattel slavery and the cultural incapacity of whiteness to reproduce communal care without exploitation. Because of this weaponized communal incompetence, or whiteness's refusal to engage in the labor of care, the devaluation of domestic labor is inseparable from the devaluation of the erotic, which Black feminist Audre Lorde describes as a deeply human, creative force that Black women were compelled to provide for white survival. Prior to the rise of racial capitalism, the erotic functioned as a shared, life-affirming practice within African and Afro-diasporic communities. Lorde argues that the erotic is a bridge which connects the spiritual and political, those physical, emotional, and psychic expressions of what is deepest and strongest and richest within each of us, being shared. Rooted in collective care, interdependence, and a non-exploitative ethic of survival, the erotic allowed for the sharing of vulnerability and joy, grounding communal relationships in pleasure, mutual care, and accountability. The institution of chattel slavery created the material conditions for the exploitation of that erotic labor that sustained African communities, stripping the erotic from its communal context and recasting it as labor to be owned, exploited, and monetized by whiteness. African peoples were forcibly removed from their communities and brought to what was then known as Turtle Island to fill the void created by whiteness's refusal to engage in erotic labor necessary for community care. White European colonizers had attempted and failed to create sustainable and livable communities as they terrorized and violently seized indigenous American land. Whiteness, as a project of domination, therefore required a disavowal of the erotic, interdependence, care, and relationality in order to create and sustain racial hierarchy and separation. This self-inflicted severance produces a crisis. Whiteness cannot reproduce the labor of care necessary for its own survival. Blackness as servitude is constructed then to perform that care, emotional, physical, and relational work whiteness refuses to engage in. Black women become domestic servants, wet nurses, breeders, agriculture workers, profitable commodities left to the violent whim of racial capitalism. Lorde speaks to this exploitation of the erotic under patriarchy and capitalism, arguing that the principal horror of such a system robs our work of its erotic value, its erotic power, and life appeal and fulfillment. Labor is flattened as a thing to be exploited rather than an innate and crucial part of communal survival. Alongside sexual violence, legal exclusion, and economic coercion, whiteness also deploys what Hale Collins terms controlling images, or racist caricatures such as Mammy, Jezebel, and Welfare Queen, as ideological weapons that naturalize Black women's objectification and justifies their exploitation. Hale Collins argues the dominant ideology of slavery fostered the creation of socially constructed controlling images of Black womanhood, each reflecting the dominant group's interest in maintaining Black women's subordination. These controlling images or caricatures of Black women's connection to their pre-described labor justified Black women's super exploitation. In her book, Not Your Mother's Mammy, The Black Domestic Worker in Transatlantic Women's Media, Tracy Walters writes about how the construction of Black female stereotypes hinged on their usefulness to white patriarchy, either hypersexualized as Jezebels or desexualized as Mammies. These images did not simply attempt to define Black womanhood. It describes where Black women could labor, how they could be treated, and what forms of violence could be enacted on them without consequence. Mammy was created to justify the economic exploitation of house slaves, symbolizing the dominant group's perceptions of the ideal Black female relationship to elite white male power. Mammies were loyal, subservient, grand, motherly figures in white households. They were non-threatening to white women's sense of control in their homes, as their undesirability as old, large-body maids made them sexually unappealing to white masters. This mammification of Black women legitimized the economic exploitation of Black domestic labor as care and familial devotion rather than coercion. As Walters argues, the Mammy figure falsely framed Black women's labor as mutually beneficial. She became part of the family, even as that white family profited from her subjugation. Black feminist Barbara Christian argues that these controlling images of Black women served as a reservoir for the fears of Western culture and a surrogate to contain all those fears of the physical female. Because whiteness, especially white femininity, required a violent severance from the full erotic, female sexuality and fertility were decoupled from each other. White men used this to control the erotic and the gendering of white femininity. Good white women were expected to deny their female sexuality. Jezebels weaponized their sexuality, and mammies disavowed their sexuality for the sake of their jobs. The suppression of the erotic through hypersexualization or mammification was a direct attempt to sever Black women from their full capacity for feeling, self-knowing, and action. These images of Black domestic labor created during the antebellum period functioned as a symbolic bridge between Black and white society that defined and separated white femininity and leisure from Black female deviancy in labor. This enabled white women to move more freely in public and political life, claiming feminist progress while relying on the very systems of racial capitalism that oppressed their Black sisters. Lorde sharply critiques this dynamic in her 1979 speech, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," delivered at an academic feminist conference, once again at Mount Holyoke College. She states, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support." Lorde's warning highlights how the suppression of Black women's access to the erotic is an important tool for the master, crafted to distort, contain, and exploit. As Lorde writes, "When we look away from the importance of the erotic in development and sustenance of power, we use each other as objects of satisfaction, rather than share our joy in the satisfying. These housewives, desperate to access the power that patriarchal capitalism promised them, turned away from the erotic and towards control of Black bodies, Black women's bodies in particular. Rather than recognizing the interdependence of their labor and struggle with Black women, they defaulted to domination, mistaking proximity to whiteness and control for freedom. These forms of racialized violence operated in tandem with divide and conquer labor strategies, fragmenting workers along racial and gendered lines in order to maintain white domination and protect the social order that depended on Black women's labor. Through this process, the mammification of all Black femme labor is completed." And the thing about controlling images is that they don't stay in history books. They show up in workplaces, classrooms, and nonprofits, in so-called aggressive spaces. Black women enter into the primary labor market unknowingly carrying the mark of Mammy. And that's exactly what started happening to me. In my role as an inclusive engagement specialist, capacity building coordinator, communications coordinator, de facto harm and repair coordinator, and scribe, and facilitator or extraordinaire for the Hampshire County Food Policy Council, co-facilitator for the SJE Platform Circle, and the BIPOC Affinity Group, as well as several other search committees, working groups, unofficial joy and creativity coordinator, I was expected to show up and educate my colleagues, bosses, and community partners, remain cordial, silly, and support the culture of care that we supposedly had. As long as my Blackness was not disruptive, I could be in that space and be relatively comfortable. Not fully comfortable because Mammy isn't supposed to be paid, so you know they're mad about that.
Maybe start just with a color that describes how you're feeling today.
But my comfort was never relevant to begin with. Oftentimes, this meant I was holding space for people who didn't respect my role or expertise because I was the youngest and Blackest person in the room. Tracy McMillan refers to this phenomenon in her essay, Dying to be Competent, where she talks about the assumption of Black women's incompetence. She explains, "We cannot know ourselves, express ourselves in a way that the context will render legible, or that prompts people with power to respond to us as agentic beings." In other words, white people still operate through the racist, paternalistic idea that Black people are too dumb to care for ourselves, let alone be educated enough to even know more than them. They don't view us as capable of knowing the things that are oppressing us, or knowing really anything about our lived realities, or even having any type of merit when we have degrees. In their roles, most Black women are overqualified, yet continue to be micromanaged and undermined. It is common for our interests and opinions to be ignored, invalidated, or met with condescending remarks. The feeling of being unseen is a common experience for us, as our contributions are often disregarded and not given the recognition they deserve, even when we put in just as much, if not more. At work, this meant that I was barely listened to, and my ideas were often only supported if they aligned with my white colleagues' understanding of the work. I was either shut down or unsupported in the work that brought me the most joy and felt most relevant to the actual work we were doing. Progressive whites especially cling to their innate belief in our inferiority, because they're educated. They have master's degrees and learned all about racism and systemic oppression in their multicultural classes. Meanwhile, the average Black person doesn't have a bachelor's degree and could tell you more about racism as a public health issue than any white woman with a master's could. It's like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which occurs when a person's lack of knowledge and skill in a certain area causes them to overestimate their own competence. White people are literally indoctrinated into believing that they're overly competent in every aspect of Black life. I was creating and holding these workshops while supporting my colleagues with their own project, while also having to sit with the heaviness of the work we were doing. The Palestinian Palestinian genocide had been going on for months, and my country's own genocide had reached stage 9, extermination, just the year prior. I was grappling with the erasure of my own people's pain and violence. I don't even know if people knew there was a genocide happening in Mali, on top of their decades of desertification that had exacerbated their food and refugee crisis. They also let me know that white people didn't like to read or be educated, which we know because of chattel slavery. This meant that I was often facilitating conversations about racism and food apartheid and decolonialism with people who thought those words were too controversial for us to use and might turn away some potential community members. I was expected to soften my language to maintain a certain level of comfort for partners, even at the expense of undermining the very values we had all created and consented to. Meanwhile, my job was literally to build people's capacity to not only engage in these conversations, but turn them into action to change our food system. I wanted to introduce the FPC partners to the 2007 Nyalini Declaration, which brought together 500 representatives from 80 organizations of peasants, family farmers, artisanal fisherfolk, indigenous peoples, landless peoples, rural workers, migrants, pastoralists, forest communities, women, youth, consumers, environmental and urban movements, who had gathered together in the village of Nyalini in Selinge, Mali, to strengthen a global movement for food sovereignty. When I grew frustrated with this, I was told I couldn't leave the capacity building coordinator role because it was part of my job description. But when my coworker wanted to get out of her role in the FPC, we changed her job description. I was constantly facilitating meetings because I was such a great facilitator, and I made people feel seen and heard. I was a founding partner of the Harm Repair Circle because literal racism happened and the white people in the space did nothing to repair it or even address it. I spent more time helping white women process their feelings than I did processing my own feelings. Every part of my labor was catering to the care, comfort, and growth of whiteness. And of course, if that wasn't enough subjugation, white women decided that they could not speak to me directly about issues that they had that obviously actually weren't that deep. Yet they chose instead to report me to people with all the institutional power anytime there was an issue. This is no different than white women calling the police on black people just for existing in public or even at their own homes. Or white college students calling the police on the Muslim Student Association playing volleyball on a Friday evening because God forbid you just go outside and you're just like, hey, y'all niggas is a little loud. Can you quiet down? Or God forbid you just join the fucking volleyball game. God forbid you just talk to me like I'm a human being. Like, hey T, I love that maple butter is here, but we shouldn't bring dogs into the kitchen. And I'd be like, you're right. You should go talk to the white woman that beckoned her into the kitchen because my black ass would never have let her in there. It's like, oh, could have had a conversation instead of sending me an email about how I violated a policy that I know that you made up because I have spies everywhere.
Cause I'm an international super spy. Super spy!
The policy wasn't made up, as a side note, just the fact that I violated it was bullshit. Anyways, I was forced into the mammy role, and my experience isn't unique to me. Black women have been dealing with mammification since we've entered their workforce, particularly in progressive workplaces, because those are the spaces where the overlap of white supremacy and social justice clash into each other.
Abolitionist principles and ideas around using systems and leaning into systems of harm and dismantling, engaging with policing and all that. Y'all forget all of that when it comes to black women.
Liberalism depends on this delicate balance of maintaining allegiance to whiteness in order to maintain their privilege and power while simultaneously fighting against its violent impact, but only enough to maintain whiteness as a structure of dominance and absolve white progressives of their white guilt.
And it's like they build this tower that they know they're going to they're not going to snatch you from, they're going to shove you off of. And then when you fall and crack into a million pieces, they'll act like we don't know what happened or what took place.
Psychologist and black activist Frantz Fanon talks about this in his book, Wretched of the Earth, when he writes about the middle class under colonialism, the group of people whose entire identity depends on maintaining the system that gives them status, even while they claim to be against it. In the nonprofit world, that's the managerial class. In Fanon's world, it's the petite bourgeoisie. The directors, the coordinators, the people with master's degrees in social justice who still need the system to stay exactly the way it is so they can keep their position in it. They learn the language of equity, care, community, anti-racism, in order to hide under and maintain the same power structures that necessitate their master's degrees to begin with. But the second you actually challenge their comfort, the second you threaten their authority, the second you stop performing the role expected from you, suddenly the rules change. Suddenly it's about professionalism. Suddenly it's about policy. Suddenly it's about funding. Suddenly it's about you being disruptive and not supporting a community of care. You see, Mammy isn't allowed to be angry. Maybe isn't allowed to have emotions other than those that make white people feel comfortable. And the moment whiteness feels discomfort, Mammy must be punished. Slave masters thought they were good people too. They told themselves they were kind and benevolent. They told themselves they treated their enslaved people well. They convinced themselves that they were nice, white, good Christians and were genuinely baffled when their slaves ran away or demanded their freedom. But you can't be nice and white during a genocide. Once Black people were able to access primary labor market positions, in spite of white supremacist terror, the rules of the game of the primary labor market shifted, introducing a new subordinate primary labor market as explained by labor segmentation theorist Edwards et al. I'm not saying all of them white people's names, that's too many. There's too many. They argue that independent primary jobs encourage high skill levels, creative problem solving, and self-initiating characteristics. In contrast, subordinate primary jobs like factory and clerical work are de-skilled, encourage discipline, responsiveness to rules and authority, and acceptance of a firm's goal. Subordinary primary segment workers become targets of middle management surveillance, plagued by low wages, strict supervision, job instability, high turnover, and rigid promotion ladders. Independent primary segment workers operate in the middle management class, akin to slave foremen and prison guards tasked with creative enforcement of the subordinates' exploitation. The violence used by the slave foreman transforms into institutional, emotional, and professional violence in the progressive workplace, or labor governance for Black bodies. So anytime I stopped making white people comfortable, a punishment happened. A new rule, a new policy, a new procedure, a mandatory in-person meeting, a reprimand, a reminder about my place. And well, once I began to talk about Palestine, things really escalated. But to understand why, we need to talk about the limits of liberalism.